Hi everyone, welcome to this CPD from the Wollstonecraft Society. I'm going to be talking to you today about the Wollstonecraft School Programme. This is a programme that the Wollstonecraft Society have designed. It's specifically for Year 5 and Year 6 students, so higher Key Stage 2. And the idea is that it will introduce Mary to these younger generation of students, and you'll learn about Mary's thoughts, Mary's actions, Mary's words, and why Mary's relevant to today. And we hope that this resource will add to women's histories teaching in school, but also it can be used within the RE curriculum in terms of ethics and values. And it's also a great local history study, but also it can help and contribute towards British values and perhaps some of your school values too. So I'm going to work our way through our PowerPoint. Don't worry if you're not sure about Mary Wollstonecraft, if you're not quite sure who she is or what she's famous for. We're going to go through that together. Mary is best known as being one of Britain's first feminists. So we're going to be learning about Mary, who she was, what she did, and why she's so important to today. We're going to be finding out what being a Wollstonecraft school means and how you can become one. And then we're going to learn more about the Wollstonecraft school programme, how it works, how it can support work within your school, and how you can become an accredited Wollstonecraft school. We've already got 5 Wollstonecraft schools across the UK, so it's a really exciting time to be joining as a Wollstonecraft school. And as now I'm recording it, we're in the month of March, which is Women's History Month. We've just had International Women's Day. It's a really fantastic resource that you can use in schools to celebrate that. So who was Mary? Mary is famous in her own right for many reasons, and also the relationships that she has. So Mary Wollstonecraft, as I mentioned before, is kind of known as being one of Britain's first feminists. She's the first woman really in the UK to start thinking about women's right to education. That's a really important part, and obviously is very relevant today because there's many women and girls across the world who still don't have access to education. So Mary is born in Spitalfields in London, but her family move around a lot. Her dad is a winemaker and not a particularly successful merchant. There's lots of drama growing up, business deals going wrong, so they have to move around a lot. So she lives in Barking, where you can see in this picture. They moved to South Wales for a while too. And so it's a quite tragic, difficult childhood, and hopefully this might show Mary's kind of struggles in later life and paint a context there for some of your younger learners. Obviously, some of this content is quite difficult. I'll explain how we do this in an accessible way for Year 5 and 6 learners. But, you know, for you as adults and educators, it's important that you have the context. So Mary's dad is an alcoholic and is abusive towards Mary's mum. So it's a very difficult childhood. She's got quite a few siblings, and she is a girl. She doesn't have access to education at this time in the 1700s. And women are thought of as property. So you are the property of your father until you become the property of your husband. And this is the route, the life that's marked out for women at that time. Again, lots of parallels with women, unfortunately, and their experiences around the world today. So it's definitely not something that's just still stuck in the past. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of financial failures in her family, and they move quite a lot. Now, because of this, I think that Mary in her young life really forges some really strong relationships with women. So they move for a while to Beverley in the East Riding of Yorkshire, and when she's there, she meets a friend, Jane, and they have a really passionate relationship. Now, this is a theme that runs through Mary's story. We don't know for sure about these relationships because we weren't there, and I think that's an important message for kind of all history. We can just guess as much as we can, but certainly when it comes to the letters that she wrote between Jane and Fanny Blood, her friend that you can see here, they're very passionate. Mary is very protective of her friends, and because of that, there is a lot of literature and writing about Mary in the queer sense. Now, this might be something that you might feel comfortable addressing with your students. It might fit in with your teaching. In the resources I'll explore later, and in the teacher's guide, it's definitely up to you. It's a completely optional thing, like most parts of Mary's story. I mentioned about the abuse that she suffered as a child. That may or may not be relevant or appropriate for your learners. And similarly, when we're talking about Mary's mental health, there are quite a few suicide attempts, and she unfortunately dies quite a difficult, tragic death quite young. So again, it's up to you. You have complete autonomy as to what you think is appropriate with your learners. So there's definitely a queer history there, if that's something that you're interested in exploring, kind of famous figures that have kind of queer relationships, most famously with Fanny Blood. So Mary really relies on these female relationships growing up. It's really important to her because she doesn't have that kind of family network to rely on. And I think that admiration for other women runs all the way through her life. So when Mary she's always kind of gifted and talented, but she's not allowed to go to school. She's not educated. Now, girls could go to school at this period, but it depended if your family would pay for private education, and they weren't particularly wealthy enough. So being a kind of lower middle class woman, work was also difficult. It was very difficult for someone like Mary to become financially independent at the time, because as I mentioned before, it's assumed you're reliant on your father or a husband. Now, Mary was not particularly interested in marriage at this point in time. That does change, and we'll explore that a bit later. So she's not interested in marriage, and she writes about this, and again is one of the first kind of women to write about this, how perhaps marriage is a form of slavery and things like this. There's lots of interesting parts of Mary's story that resonate, especially with today, and that spoke to, and that later suffrage movement, suffragettes and feminists, go back to. Mary really hasn't been explored enough, and has only really there's been a resurgence over the past 40 years into Mary's story. So we hope that you and your learners can be part of bringing Mary back to life and her importance. So she moves away from home as soon as she can. She does some kind of nannying jobs, which she doesn't like the way that she's treated, and feels quite rightly that it may be a little bit beneath her. She's not being able to use her brain and stretch her talents. And so what happens is that she moves and she decides to open a school. Now, that's kind of one of the only employment that's open to someone of Mary's status at the time. It's not often that these women work, but one thing that is open to someone from Mary's kind of status is you can be a teacher. That's kind of seen as socially acceptable. So, and she's very interested in education, and as I said before, she moves to an area, Newington Green, which is on the border of Hackney and Islington, and she opens a school. She takes her sisters and they open it together, and it's kind of a school and a boarding house, and it's here she writes her first book, Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. And this book is a really pioneering text, and it's talking about education, pedagogy in a way that is not kind of top down and rote learning. And this is in the mid 1700s, so it's very pioneering. And she's talking about the values of teaching morals and ethics and things like that. And then when she's at Newington Green, she meets this really intellectual community there that support and respect a woman having intellectual pursuits. Now, she's written a book. She's being paid for this work, and she's being published. So she's one of the first real British writers that we have, women British writers, that is a professional writer and author as well. So she's not just a political thinker, she's not just a teacher, but she is someone who we very much respect and think of as being one of the first professional writers. And one of her most famous texts that she writes after Newington Green is a vindication of the rights of women. And vindication of the rights of women is a one of her most famous texts, which is part of a wider conversation that's happening at the time of the French Revolution, about that it's not just enough to give liberation for men and for men from different standing, as what the French Revolution, one of the things they were trying to do, but it's important for women. And it's also one of the first texts that kind of mentioned that women should have a place in a democratic society and should be able to be represented in that democratic society. So Mary's really involving herself in really international intellectual conversations about liberation and enlightenment period and politics at a time, and she's putting in the work that's needed so that women have the same representation. This is a portrait, one of the most famous portraits of Mary by John Opie. She's actually pregnant in this picture, which you might be able to kind of see as you look down towards her stomach. And another part of Mary's story is that she goes on to have Mary Shelley, who, as we know, is a very famous writer and goes on to write Frankenstein. And Mary's really the progenitor of the Romantic movement. You know, her daughter and Shelley go and sit on Mary's grave and they read Mary's writing. Mary didn't go to school, and so her writing is very passionate and it's not bound by kind of the scriptures of the style of the day. So when you read Mary's writing, when it's non-fiction writing, you really get a sense of her character, which I think really inspired the Romantic movement to kind of move away and think about emotion and passion and things in a way that hasn't been done before. So this is a quote, one of the most famous quotes from Mary's Vindication of the Rights of Woman. "I do not wish for women to have power over men, but over themselves." And I think that's a big part of feminism that is misunderstood in you know, when people maybe haven't engaged with feminist theory and politics, that perhaps these kind of things get missed, that it's about, you know, gender parity and equality, but also understanding equity and the struggles that women have gone through in the past and still today. So I mentioned about her daughter, so that you can see her there on the left-hand side. And she has that daughter with William Godwin, who's also a very famous philosopher at the time. They actually get married, and they're a bit of a power couple, but both of them had written previously about how they didn't agree with marriage, but for the sake of their child, they didn't want them to be kind of disenfranchised in a society that saw marriage as really, really important and potentially immoral to have children out of wedlock. Before this, I should say that Mary did have another child too, when she went to France during the Revolution, which is arguably not the best of ideas, but because of that, we have an amazing historical record of France in that time and her being there and the rebellion and resistance that happened. And Mary's there, and she has a child out of wedlock with an American Revolutionary soldier who unfortunately leaves her. And so this is Mary's second child. And she, before she has Mary, does lots of amazing things. She's one of the first kind of travel writers, women travel writers, and she goes around Scandinavia with this child and writes travel literature, which again inspires the Romantic period, talking about mountains and the beauty of nature and things. And as you can guess, in this picture here on the right hand side, she's a massive influence in terms of suffrage and the suffrage movement too, and especially second wave feminism in the 70s too, when you get the women's liberation movement. So Mary helped create positive changes in the world and tried to make the world a fairer place. It wasn't for her just about women, but it was about changing the world so it's better for everyone, people living in poverty, racism. Mary was very involved in the abolition movement to get rid of slavery. So she's really thinking about changing the whole world for the benefit of everyone, but she's coming at it through her lived experience of being a woman. So as I mentioned, lots of Mary's hopes for the future have still not come true today, over 200 years later. So this is a recording, obviously, but what I'd ask you to do at this moment in time is maybe take a minute to discuss in your groups or just make some notes yourself on these questions below. So what changes do you think Mary would be happy to see in our world today? What do you think Mary would be disappointed to see hasn't changed or progressed much since she was alive? What campaigns do you think Mary would support if she were alive today? You might want to think about things like climate justice and some of the things that your students might be involved in. And what school value can we see in Mary Wollstonecraft? And hopefully this will really embed Mary into your school values. So what is the Wollstonecraft school programme? So as we mentioned, it's for Year 5 and Year 6 students. And the idea is that it introduces Mary in an age-appropriate way and tells the students and explores with the students why Mary is an important figure to talk about and remember today and what her legacy is. And the idea is that it's a small, manageable programme that you can complete in a week. And at the end of that, you can become accredited by the Wollstonecraft Society and become a Wollstonecraft school. And we will send a certificate over to you and a digital logo so that you can have that on your headers and on your websites and celebrate that. The Wollstonecraft Society may also be available for some local press and things like that too. Any questions, I'll share the email, but it's education@wollstonecraftsociety.org if you want more information about this. But the idea is that this is a self-guided resource. So hopefully we've given you enough support with this and the resources available for you to be able to deliver it yourself in school. So it's essentially a human rights programme. That's the focus here, as was Mary's. And it's a whole school approach. And the idea through that is that you use the resource with Year 5 and Year 6 students, but at the end, they share their learning with the whole school through an assembly. That might not always be feasible, but the idea of the programme is that they do share their learning with someone else in the school. It might be another class. That would be nice with a whole school during an assembly, or maybe perhaps in some other way like a display in the classroom or something. But the idea is that it is shared with the whole school. And it's separated into 3 sessions. So we say that it's maybe quite appropriate to do it within 1 week. Perhaps if you have like a PSHE enrichment day or something, this might fit in quite well there. So you've got 3 lessons, and the lessons are about 50 minutes, as most school lessons are. So you've got lesson 1, which is an introduction to Mary through the comic that I'll show you in a moment. Then lesson 2 kind of consolidates the class's learning, and then you work together on putting on an assembly, and then you share that in the 3rd session through the assembly, and we give you a PowerPoint template. But the idea is that the learners add to that template with their newfound knowledge, and then they share it with whoever they can. So once you've completed all of those steps, what we ask is for some evidence of your learning, and also it's super helpful for us to get feedback to make sure that this programme progresses and improves and is fit for purpose for the learners. So we ask you to complete the steps, and then if you can scan in or photograph 5 of the learner feedback forms, and they are a super quick 5-minute exercise where learners draw around their hand and then they give us 5 pieces of feedback. And then we ask you as an educator to fill in the quick online survey, which we send over to you. And then we will make sure that you get your certification of accreditation and the digital logo, as I mentioned. So the resources are all available at this link here, wollstonecraftsociety.org/resources -1. And you will see that there are a few different resources available to you. So one of the things that it gives you is a link to the online comic. Sometimes the Wollstonecraft Society and through funders have funding to supply printed versions of this. So don't be afraid to get in touch with us at education@wollstonecraftsociety.org if you think that might work better for your learners, and we'll do everything that we can to try and help. But we have an online version of this comic, which goes through Mary's life story. And I can explore that with you a little bit more later. It's called Mary Wollstonecraft: A Life in Pictures. If you want to Google that, it will come up through issue and you'll be able to explore that yourself. But the link is also on that resource. It was comic designed with a 19-year-old graphic artist who's really beautifully illustrated and uses age-appropriate language. So that's how they learn about Mary's story. And then you work your way through PowerPoint 1 with the learners, and there's certain tasks at set points as they go through the comic, which just consolidates their learning. And they work through their learner's workbook, which you can see here. So at certain points in the PowerPoint, it will say task 1, and then you go to your workbook. Now, to make it easy for you, we've given you a facilitator's notes here, which just ensures that you know all of the answers, and that you can just be one step ahead of the learners. So again, we've tried to make this, I'm a teacher, this has been developed with teachers. We're trying to make it as easy as possible. So if you've got something where you want to celebrate women's history, or this fits in with your curriculum, you should be able to pick this up the day before and deliver it the next day. There really shouldn't be, as long as you've got the resources, there shouldn't be too much background work for you. So this gives you all the information, it gives you prompts, it gives you extra contextual information, and it gives you the answers. You've got PowerPoint 2, as I mentioned before, which you use in the second session, which consolidates their learning, but then also is the template for the assembly. So you work through filling in that template together, and then you have the assembly in session 3. And there's the link again to the comic, and here you can see. So you've got, this is later on in Mary's life, where she has the marriage with William Godwin. She has Mary Shelley, and then unfortunately dies in childbirth after having Mary Shelley. So this is an example of some of the workbook. If you're doing this with other facilitators, it might be worth getting up the comic now, and then kind of modelling answers. Might be easier for you to do it that way, and then you've got your thoughts and feelings, and you've already kind of digested this information. But it's a nicely designed workbook. It's got accessible language, and there's extension tasks for differentiation, and there's also creative ways. It doesn't rely on just writing. So as you can see here, it's asking for drawing and things like that. So the accreditation process, how that works is you complete the programme and the assembly, like I mentioned. If you can invite us to the assembly, if we're available, please do. We'd absolutely love the invite, and if we can make it, we will. So you complete the programme, you scan and take photos of 5 learner workbooks, just the feedback at the end. It's the last sheet there with the hand, and then you send it to this email address here. You fill in this teacher feedback form. Don't worry, we'll send that to you, and then we will get that over to you, including the logo, and we will make sure that you get the lovely certificate. This is a picture here of that feedback. So it's quite a short exercise, and it's really important that we get this to improve. In this pilot year, we've done really well, and we've managed to engage 5 schools. We've got a lot of teacher feedback and improved on the resources, but we definitely need not just your feedback, but the learner feedback to make sure that this is fit for purpose. Here's some of the feedback that we've had before. We've worked with schools around the UK, as I mentioned. This is a school nearby in Hackney, and this is some feedback from the deputy head teacher, and just is an idea of how they used it within their school curriculum and how it met their school values. So here's the links and the resources again. So you've got the online comic here. If you would like some differentiated resources, for example, if you're in Barking and Dagenham and want to use this programme, we already have differentiated resources because we made them for another school. So they're more Barking and Dagenham specific. So just email us and we'll send them. Again, if you have a local link with Mary, perhaps you live in Lagan in Wales and you want a differentiated one, email us. If we can, we will try to accommodate. For more for information on the Wollstonecraft Society, then here's the link here. You can find out more about their work. Please do follow us. Anything that you can do to help us reach more schools around the UK is very welcome. For paper copies of the comic, to see if you if we can provide that, then please do contact us here and see if that is something that we can offer. Again, if we can help, then we will do everything that we can to try. And the most important link that you need really to get all of the resources is on the Wollstonecraft Society website. So you'll see that there. Go on the Wollstonecraft Society website, and there is a link to the resources in the top header. And from there, you will be able to download everything. All of the resources are also on the Times Educational Supplement, and they're all absolutely free of charge. The whole programme is free of charge. I think that is all the information that you might need. So again, it's a self-guided program. So the idea is that you'll be able to deliver that in the school yourself. If you've got any questions, please do email the Wollstonecraft Society, and we really look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.